The rain came down hard on Burnside that November. The kind of rain that made Portland feel like the bottom of a bowl, everything draining toward the river, the gutters full and loud. Marcus Webb had been driving for 6 hours straight, and his lower back had started its familiar protest somewhere around the Morrison Bridge, a dull ache that spread outward like a stain. He rolled his shoulders, checked the meter, and told himself 40 more minutes. Just 40 more minutes, and he could go home to the apartment on Southeast Holgate, eat whatever was left in the refrigerator, and sleep until his alarm pulled him back to the warehouse at 5:30 in the morning. He had done the math twice that evening, in the way he always did when money got tight enough to require actual attention. The electric bill was due Friday. The payment on the transmission repair he'd put on the credit card 3 months ago was already 2 weeks late. He had enough in checking to cover one of those two things, not both. And the tips on a Tuesday night in the rain were not going to close that gap by any meaningful distance. He drove and he calculated, and the rain kept falling, and the city kept moving around him the way cities do, indifferent to the arithmetic of its residents. The light at Burnside and 23rd went red. He stopped. The wipers beat a slow rhythm across the windshield, smearing the streetlight reflections into long orange streaks. He reached for the water bottle in the cup holder, took a drink, set it back. Through the rain-blurred glass, he could see a couple arguing outside a bar, their voices lost behind the weather. A man in a yellow raincoat walked a dog with extraordinary calm, both of them soaked, neither one bothered by it. That was when he heard it. It came from the back seat, and it was so small, so tentative, that his first thought was that a cat had somehow gotten into the cab. The sound was thin and wavering, like something that had been trying to stay quiet for a long time and had finally given up. He checked his mirror and saw nothing. The back seat looked empty. He turned around in the driver's seat and reached for the dome light switch. The baby was wrapped in a pink flannel blanket and tucked against the base of the rear passenger seat, half hidden by shadow. She was so new to the world that her face still had the compressed, urgent look of the recently arrived, her skin flushed deep red, her tiny fist clenched against her chest. The flannel blanket was damp. The umbilical cord had been tied off with what looked like a strip of cloth, carefully knotted, but rough in the way of improvisation. She was crying in that particular way of newborns, who have nearly exhausted themselves, each cry smaller than the last, each one a diminishing investment in the possibility of rescue. On her left wrist, a thin silver bracelet, the kind sold in small jewelry shops easily overlooked, engraved with a single letter C. Marcus Webb was not a man who panicked. He had worked warehouse floors long enough to understand that the worst thing you can do in an emergency is let your hands get ahead of your brain. He pulled the cab to the curb, put it in park, and picked up his cell phone. He called 911 before he picked up the baby because he understood in some calm, procedural way that the sequence mattered. He told the dispatcher what he had. He gave the address. He answered the questions they asked. And then while he waited for the ambulance, he reached into the back seat and lifted the baby from the floor with both hands and held her against his chest inside his jacket where it was warm. She stopped crying. He would think about that later, many times in the years that followed. The way she stopped crying. The way she settled against him with a kind of sudden purposeful stillness, as though she had been looking for exactly this specific warmth, this particular heartbeat. He was 31 years old, and he had not held a baby since the last time he had held a baby, and that memory was the kind that lived below. Language below articulation, in the place where grief becomes architectural, where it stops being a feeling and becomes the shape of a room you live inside. He held this baby in his jacket and felt something in that room shift, just slightly, just enough to change the quality of the air. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. A police officer arrived 2 minutes after that. There were questions, forms a timeline. Marcus answered everything accurately and completely. He was good at that. He gave his name, his license number, the cab company, the time he picked up his last fare, the route he'd been driving, the exact moment he first heard the sound. He said he had not seen anyone place the child in the vehicle. He said he had no knowledge of who the child belonged to. He said all of this standing in the rain outside his cab while the paramedics worked over the baby under the yellow-white light of the ambulance interior. And when they asked if he needed anything, he said no, and meant it, which was not quite true, but was the answer he always gave. They took her to Providence. He drove home. He sat at his kitchen table for 40 minutes before he realized he hadn't turned on any lights. His wife Sarah had died 26 months earlier in the delivery room at OHSU on a Tuesday afternoon in September that had been bright and warm in the way that Oregon Septembers sometimes are, as if the season hadn't received the news yet. The baby, a boy they had already named Thomas, did not survive either. The doctors explained what had happened. Marcus listened to all of it with the same careful attention he gave everything, asking clarifying questions, nodding at the right moments, shaking hands with the people who extended them. He drove home alone. He went to work 3 days later because there was no structural reason not to, because the warehouse did not particularly care about the geometry of his loss, and because standing still felt like a luxury he could not afford. In the 26 months between that September and this November rain, he had not thought seriously about any future that extended more than a few weeks in any direction. He paid bills, he worked, he ate, he slept. His friend Ray Kowalski, who managed the day shift at the warehouse and had known Marcus since they were both loading trucks at a distribution center in Gresham 15 years ago, said once with the blunt affection of a man who did not do poetry, "You're disappearing, Marcus, like a slow leak. You can't even see it. But I can." Marcus had nodded and said he appreciated that and changed the subject to a scheduling problem on the floor, and Ray had let him because that was the kind of friendship, it was the kind that knew when to push and when to stand down. He visited Providence the next morning before his warehouse shift. He told himself it was follow-up, that he wanted to confirm the baby had been properly cared for, that this was a practical visit and nothing more. The nurse on duty, a broad-shouldered woman named Carol, who wore her gray hair in a bun and had the manner of someone who had seen enough of the world's trouble to remain unshockable, told him the baby was stable, healthy, and currently unnamed in the system. Marcus stood at the window of the nursery for 6 minutes. Then he went to work. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, Carol had started recognizing him without looking up from her desk. By the end of the second week, she called him by name and had coffee ready when she saw him coming down the hall, which he accepted without comment because refusing small kindnesses was one of his less useful habits. The police had circulated the case. No one came forward. The county's child welfare system began its own procedures, and Marcus watched from a careful distance as the bureaucratic machinery of abandonment moved through its stages: documentation, waiting periods, formal declarations. He was aware in a way he did not examine too closely that he was developing an attachment he had no legitimate claim to. He was a single man in his early 30s with a 2-bedroom apartment, a warehouse job, and a credit card carrying a balance. He was not by any reasonable actuarial measure an obvious candidate for parenthood. He understood this. He also understood with the same plain clarity with which he understood load weights and shift schedules that the feeling he had when he held that baby in the cab on a rainy Tuesday night in November was the first feeling in 26 months that had made the walls of that internal room feel like they might, under sufficient pressure, come down. Ray was eating a sandwich at the break room table when Marcus told him he was thinking about filing for adoption. Ray put the sandwich down and looked at him for a long moment. "You sure about this? Raising a kid alone is the hardest job in the world." Marcus considered the question seriously, the way he considered all serious questions. "I know, but she was in my cab. That means something." Ray picked up his sandwich, again studied it, set it back down. "That's not a reason, Marcus." A beat, a pause, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence between them. "Maybe not, but it's enough." The process took 8 months. There were home visits, background checks, financial assessments, parenting classes held on Thursday evenings in a church basement in Selwood, where Marcus was usually the only attendee under 50 and the only one who never asked questions, which the instructor initially mistook for disengagement and later recognized as the behavior of someone who was already taking notes in his head. He filed every form correctly on the first attempt. He missed 0 appointments. He painted the second bedroom of his apartment a soft yellow because he had read that yellow was associated with optimism, and he figured the baby could use some optimism given how she'd started. When the judge finalized the adoption on a Thursday morning in July, Marcus sat in the parking lot of the courthouse for 12 minutes before starting the car. He had named her Claire after no one in particular because when he said it out loud in his empty apartment, the syllables settled in the air with a quality of permanence he found reassuring. He kept the silver bracelet with the letter C in the top drawer of his dresser, wrapped in a piece of cloth. He told himself he kept it because it was hers, because it had been with her at the beginning, because someday she might want to know the details of where she came from. He did not examine the other reason, which was that the letter felt like something left deliberately a marker, an acknowledgement that someone had known her name even before she had one. Claret, too, was a creature of pure energy and zero self-preservation instinct, launching herself off furniture with absolute confidence in her own immortality, waking at 5:30 with the specific enthusiasm of someone who could not believe the day had arrived again. Marcus learned to braid hair by watching tutorials on his laptop at 11 o'clock at night, his large hands moving through the exercises with the methodical patience he brought to mechanical problems, the results improving slowly over weeks until Claire's braids went from structurally embarrassing to merely imperfect to eventually something approaching competent. The night he finally got them right, Claire laughed so hard at the expression on his face that she slid off her chair, and Marcus sat on the kitchen floor next to her and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something uncomplicated and weightless, which he did not name because naming things too precisely had a way of making them fragile. Claire at 4 learned to draw. She started as most children do with circles and sticks and approximations of faces, but within a few months, something in her approach had shifted, becoming deliberate, in a way that her preschool teacher felt was unusual enough to mention to Marcus at a conference he attended still in his warehouse clothes, having come directly from a late shift. He sat in a small plastic chair across a small plastic table from a woman named Ms. Huang, who showed him Claire's drawings with the careful reverence of someone presenting evidence. They were full of light and shelter, these drawings. Houses with warm windows, figures under umbrellas in the rain, hands holding hands in a way that conveyed protection through gesture alone. She has something, Ms. Huang said, and Marcus looked at the drawings and thought that he knew what that something was, though he couldn't have put it into words, which was fine, because he generally distrusted things that could be put into words too easily. The afternoon, Claire was asked by a substitute teacher where her mother was. Marcus was in the middle of a 12-hour shift and did not find out until he picked her up. She was quiet in the truck on the way home, looking out the side window in a way that was not her usual way of looking at things. He waited. He had learned early that Claire processed things at her own pace and that the worst thing you could do was rush her towards speech. When they got home, she sat at the kitchen table and he put crackers and peanut butter in front of her and sat across from her and waited some more. Finally, not looking up from the crackers, Mrs. Calloway asked where my mommy was. He did not fill the silence immediately. "What did you say?" She picked up a cracker. "I didn't know what to say." He was quiet for a moment, choosing. "Some families look different from each other. Ours is just you and me, and that's a whole lot." She thought about this, eating the cracker with the serious attention she gave most things. Then she nodded once, the way she did when a problem had been resolved to her satisfaction, and asked if she could watch TV. And he said yes, and the matter was closed, at least on the surface, at least for now. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and did the arithmetic that parents do, what she would ask when she was 7, when she was 10, when she was 16. How much truth fit in each container? How much could be safely held, and how much would overflow? He had been honest with her from the beginning in age-appropriate increments about the fact that she was adopted, about the fact that she had been found rather than born into a specific family, about the fact that the man on the other side of the peanut butter crackers had chosen her specifically and deliberately in the way of a decision rather than an accident. He believed she understood this. He was not certain she understood what it meant, which was different from understanding the fact of it, and he suspected the understanding of what it meant was something that would arrive in installments over years, some of those installments costly, and he intended to be there for every one of them. Claire at 6 found the bracelet. He had been at work, and the babysitter, a retired teacher from down the hall named Mrs. Potts, who watched Claire 2 afternoons a week and occasionally baked things that were aggressively nutritious, had been in the kitchen when Claire came out of Marcus's bedroom holding the small cloth-wrapped object with the particular care of a child who knows she has found something significant. Mrs. Potts called Marcus at the warehouse. He left during his break, drove home, found Claire sitting at the kitchen table with the bracelet in front of her, studying it. He sat down across from her. He told her the true version of the night he found her, with the details adjusted for the fact that she was 6 years old. And some details required adjustment, not because they were shameful, but because they required context she did not yet have. He told her about the rain. He told her about he told her about the bracelet on her wrist and the careful knot in the flannel blanket and the way she had stopped crying when he picked her up, which was a detail he had never told anyone before and was not entirely sure why he was telling her now, except that it seemed important, seemed like something she had a right to know. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things about Claire that had always surprised him, this capacity for stillness when the stakes were high. When he finished, she picked up the bracelet and turned it over, running her thumb across the engraved letter. C for Claire. He looked at her. C for Claire. She looked at the letter for another moment, then set the bracelet down with a careful decisiveness and looked up at him. Okay, just that. Okay. He put the bracelet back in the cloth and returned it to the drawer, and Claire went back to whatever she had been drawing, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment and felt the specific weight of all the things he did not yet know, which was considerable. The week before the art competition, Claire brought home a new drawing. She had been working on it in her room and came to find him in the kitchen, where he was going over a work schedule with the focused attention of a man who had learned that small logistical errors compound. She set the paper on the counter next to his coffee mug. He looked at it. Two figures in the rain, one large and one small, standing close together under a sky that was all vertical lines, all weather, all descent. At the bottom, in the careful, uneven printing of a child who had worked hard on her letters safe. He looked at it for a long time. Then he noticed the third figure. In the far corner of the drawing, barely visible, rendered in lighter pencil strokes, then everything else, a shape that could have been a person, stood at a distance from the two central figures. Not threatening, not reaching toward them, simply oriented in their direction. He asked Claire without looking up from the drawing who the third figure was. She stood on her toes to look at it with him as though reminding herself. Someone who got lost, she said, but they're still looking for the way home. He nodded slowly. That's a good drawing, Bug. She took it back to her room to finish, and he stood at the counter and drank his coffee and thought about lost things and the directions they travel. The competition notice had come home in Claire's folder 2 weeks prior, a single printed page announcing the Ashworth Foundation Young Artist Award, open to children in grades K through 8 across Multnomah County, with a scholarship prize funded personally by the CEO of Ashworth Logistics. The event would be held at the Ashworth Corporation headquarters on a Saturday morning in November, almost exactly 7 years to the month after Marcus had pulled his cab to the curb on Burnside in the rain. He had read the notice twice and set it on the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like the state of Oregon, which was where important papers went in their household, and then he had not thought about it for several days. Ray brought it up over lunch at the warehouse. He had somehow heard about it the way Ray heard about most things in Marcus's life, through a combination of genuine attention and strategic questioning. Claire should enter that, Ray said, with the confidence of a man offering an obvious observation. Marcus ate his sandwich. It's at a corporate building downtown. Ray looked at him. So, Marcus was quiet for a moment. She'd be competing against kids from very different situations. Ray put down his water bottle with a small amount of deliberate emphasis. If she doesn't go, you're already deciding for her. Marcus had no answer for that, which meant it was true. He told Claire that evening. She was at the kitchen table working on a drawing with the specific intensity she brought to work. She cared about her tongue pressed slightly to her upper lip in concentration. He set the competition notice on the table beside her drawing. She looked at it. She looked at her drawing. She looked back at the notice. Can I enter this one? She pointed to the drawing she was working on, which was, he could see now, a more developed version of the two figures in the rain, with more detail in the background, more architecture in the shelter. If you finish it, he said, and she nodded and picked up her pencil and went back to work with renewed purpose, which he took as confirmation. He spent the rest of that week thinking about the competition in the way he thought about things that made him uneasy, which was systematically breaking the unease into its components to determine which were rational and which were not. The rational concern Claire would be surrounded by children from different economic backgrounds and might feel the difference acutely in ways she didn't yet have language for. The irrational concern of vague formlessness, he could not fully articulate a sense that walking into that building was stepping towards something, that the universe had a certain quality of arrangement about this particular event that he could not logically justify and did not entirely trust. He was not a superstitious man. He filed this under irrational, which did not make it go away. The night before the competition, after Claire was asleep, he opened his top dresser drawer. The cloth-wrapped bracelet was where it always was. He picked it up, unwrapped it, held the bracelet in his palm. The sea caught the light from the hallway. He turned it over once, then again. He thought about the night he'd found it on a newborn wrist in the rain 7 years ago, thought about the drive to the hospital and the form he'd filled out, and the first morning visit and all the mornings that followed, and the 8 months of process and the yellow paint, and the Thursday evening parenting classes, and the braiding tutorials, and the peanut butter crackers, and the conversation on the kitchen floor, and the small figure at the edge of the drawing, still looking for the way home. He wrapped the bracelet back in the cloth and put it in the pocket of the jacket he was going to wear tomorrow. He could not have said why. It was not a decision exactly. It was more like the kind of action that comes before the reason for it, the hand already moving, while the explanation is still forming. He went to bed and slept 6 hours, which was more than usual. They drove downtown Saturday morning in a light rain. Claire in the passenger seat with the drawing flat on her lap, protected by a sheet of wax paper Marcus had found in the back of a kitchen drawer. She was wearing her best dress, a dark blue one with small white flowers that she'd picked herself, and her hair was braided with the competence Marcus had spent months earning. She looked out the windshield at the city moving past and did not talk much, which was her mode when she was working up to something. He found parking 2 blocks from the Ashworth building, and they walked the rest of the way, Claire holding his hand, without being asked, which she still did, when things felt significant. The lobby was marble and glass and the particular kind of lighting that costs money without appearing to warm and diffuse and directed in ways that made everyone look slightly more important than they were. Marcus felt the quality of the floor through the soles of his work boots and understood immediately why he had hesitated about this. Not because he was embarrassed. He did not embarrass easily, and he had long ago made his peace with the fact that he occupied a different economic register than certain spaces were designed for. It was more that spaces like this were designed to communicate a specific message about belonging, and he did not want Claire to receive that message on a morning when she was carrying a drawing she was proud of. She did not appear to receive it. She looked around the lobby with the open, assessing curiosity she brought to new environments, taking inventory, absorbing detail, filing it. She still held his hand, but loosely now, with the ease of someone who is present by choice rather than necessity. They followed the signs to the exhibition space on the second floor, where the children's artwork had been arranged on temporary display panels around a room that was large enough to feel significant without being overwhelming. Other families were already there. Marcus registered them the way he registered most rooms, quickly and without particular judgment, noting the general composition, finding the edges. Claire's drawing went up on the panel with the others. She stepped back and looked at it on the wall with a critical artist's eye. Her head tilted, something in her expression suggesting mild dissatisfaction with one corner of the sky. He told her it was good. She said she knew, but the rain in the upper right was a little heavy. He said the rain in Portland was a little heavy. She considered this and appeared to accept it as a valid artistic defense. They were standing near the window, Claire eating a small cookie from the refreshment table, with the focus of someone conducting a quality assessment, when the room changed. It did not change because anything loud happened. It changed the way rooms change when a certain kind of attention enters them, a pressure differential, a shift in the way people oriented their bodies without quite meaning to. Marcus noticed it before he saw the reason for it, the way experienced workers feel a change in the atmosphere of a floor before they see the cause. He looked toward the entrance. The woman who had come in was around his age or close to it. Dark hair, pale complexion, a gray suit that fit with the specific precision of things that cost real money. She moved through the room with the efficiency of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around her presence, greeting people briefly and completely leaving conversations closed behind her like doors. She was working the room in the particular way of executives at their own events, present, but controlled, generous with attention in exactly the quantities that served the occasion. She had not yet looked in their direction. Then she stopped in front of Claire's drawing. She stopped the way people stop when something reaches them before they have a chance to decide whether to let it. Her body went still in the specific way of people confronting something unexpected. Not the stillness of boredom, but its opposite, the stillness of the sudden interior activity. She stood in front of the drawing of the two figures in the rain and the third figure in the far corner, still looking for the way home, and her face did something that Marcus from across the room could not fully read, but could feel in the way that certain human expressions transmit across distance, even before they can be parsed into specifics. Claire noticed before he said anything. Children notice things first always. "Daddy," her voice was very quiet. "That lady over there, she keeps looking at my picture. And then she looks at me. And she looks—" Claire paused, searching for the word. "Scared." He looked at the woman again. She had turned from the drawing and was looking at Claire directly now, standing 15 feet away across the exhibition room, and even at that distance, even in the warm, diffuse light of the Ashworth Corporation's second floor, Marcus could see that Claire had found the right word. The woman was looking at his 7-year-old daughter with the expression of someone who has just seen a door open in a wall they believed was solid. He put his hand on Claire's shoulder. "Go look at the other paintings, okay? I'll be right here." Claire looked up at him with the specific evaluating gaze she used when she wanted to determine whether he was managing her. He met her eyes steadily. She handed him the rest of her cookie and went, and he appreciated this about her, that even at 7 she understood the difference between protection and exclusion, and could most of the time accept the former without resentment. The woman crossed the room toward him. She moved with the same efficiency she'd used with everyone else, but something underneath it was different now, something less governed. She stopped at a distance that was professional rather than personal, and up close her face was more complex than composed. A woman who had built composure the way you build a wall, brick by brick over years, and who was now aware of a crack she had not anticipated this morning. Her eyes moved to Claire's drawing on the wall beside them and then back to him. When she spoke, her voice was level, but the leveling was audible, the effort of it present in the sound. "Excuse me." A pause, not the pause of someone searching for words, but someone measuring them. "Why does your daughter look exactly like me?" Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked at the woman in front of him, and then he looked toward Claire, who was standing across the room in front of a painting of horses eating the last piece of her cookie, examining the brushwork with the seriousness of a junior critic. He looked at the woman again. He looked at his daughter, and he understood with the plain, unhurried certainty that preceded all his important understandings, that the third figure in the corner of the drawing had just walked through the door. His hand moved to the pocket of his jacket. He felt the small, wrapped shape of the bracelet there, the weight of it lighter than it had any reason to be. He did not take it out. Not yet. He looked at the woman who was looking at his daughter with that fractured, unguarded expression, and he said the only thing that made sense to say. "I think we need to talk somewhere private." They found a small conference room off the main corridor, one of those corporate holding spaces with an oval table, and 8 chairs and a whiteboard covered in someone else's strategy, the kind of room designed for problems that could be solved with enough caffeine and a clear agenda. Neither of them had coffee. Neither of them had a clear agenda. Diana Ashworth closed the door behind her and stood with her back to it for a moment, not blocking the exit so much as needing the solidity of something behind her, and Marcus pulled out a chair across the table and sat down and waited. Because he had learned early that the person who speaks first in an uncertain situation usually gives away more than they intend to. She sat eventually. She placed her tablet face down on the table in a gesture that said she was choosing to be present here in this room rather than anywhere else she could be, and that this choice was costing her something. She looked at him with the steady appraisal of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately, and he looked back with equal steadiness, and for a moment the room held nothing but the sound of the building's ventilation system doing its quiet work. He told her. He kept it sequential, factual, the way he gave shift reports, date, location, circumstances, sequence of events. The rain on Burnside, the sound from the back seat, the blanket that cord the call to 911, the 8 months of visits in process and paperwork, the adoption finalized in July, 7 years of the ordinary, extraordinary business of raising a child alone. He told it without editorializing, without the emotional underscoring that might have made it easier to receive, because he sensed that Diana Ashworth processed best when given the materials in their raw form and allowed to build the structure herself. When he reached the end of what he had to say, he reached into his jacket pocket. He placed the cloth-wrapped bracelet on the table between them and unfolded the cloth, and the silver caught the fluorescent light and the engraved C faced upward, and he did not say anything because some things arrive better in silence. She did not touch it. She looked at it for a long time with an expression that had gone very still in the way of deep water, rather than ice, something moving underneath, rather than nothing moving at all. Her hands were flat on the table. He watched her breathe. Where did you get that? Not a question exactly, the cadence of a statement that had accidentally retained a question's shape. It was on her wrist the night I found her. Something crossed her face that was not quite a flinch and not quite recognition and was entirely both. She had purchased that bracelet at a jewelry shop on Northwest 23rd, 3 days before Claire was born, paying cash, carrying it home in a small paper bag, sitting alone in her apartment that night, with the bracelet in her palm and a notebook open to a page of names. She had chosen the letter C for the name she had already decided on the name she had written third on the list because she kept second-guessing herself, the name that had felt most like a complete thing when she said it out loud in an empty room. The jeweler did not know what the C stood for. No one knew except the woman who had chosen it and the child who had worn it for the first 11 hours of her life. She did not say any of this. Instead, she stood, straightened her jacket with two precise tugs, and her voice came back to its professional register, the way a thermostat kicks on automatic trained. I'm going to need a DNA test. My legal team will contact you with the details. He watched this happen, the reassembly, and he recognized it not as coldness, but as the only tool she currently had available. He nodded once. Then, Claire is not a headline. She's a 7-year-old who has a father and a school and a bedroom with drawings on the wall. Whatever this turns out to be, she comes first. He kept his voice even, not aggressive, not pleading, stating a fact the way he stated that all facts, because it was true and because he needed her to understand it was non-negotiable before any other conversation could happen. Diana looked at him for a moment, with something shifting very slightly in her expression, as though he had said something she had not prepared a response for, and then she picked up her tablet and left the room. He sat alone in the conference room for another 2 minutes. Through the wall, he could hear the distant sounds of the exhibition, continuing children's voices, adult murmurs, the ordinary weekend sounds of people looking at art. He thought about Claire standing in front of the horse painting. He thought about the woman who had just walked out of the room. He thought about the silver bracelet still on the table, and he wrapped it back in the cloth and put it in his pocket because it was Claire's and he was not leaving it in a conference room. The 3 weeks that followed were the longest 3 weeks of Marcus Webb's adult life, and he had spent significant portions of his adult life inside periods of waiting that felt like wait. He told Ray the outline of it over lunch 2 days after the competition, keeping the details spare. Watching Ray's face move through its stages of reaction, skepticism, calculation, concern, and arriving finally at the particular expression of a man who has decided the situation is serious enough to put down his sandwich. You need a lawyer, Marcus. Not tomorrow. Today. Marcus knew Ray was right, which was different from being ready to act on it, but he called the number Ray gave him that evening, a family law attorney named Gwen Ferris, who worked out of a small office in Northeast Portland and had a reputation, Ray said, for being thorough and direct and not billing for things that didn't need billing. Gwen Ferris was all of those things. She was also honest in a way that was initially uncomfortable and subsequently valuable. The adoption paperwork was solid, she told him, reviewing the documents he brought to their first meeting in a folder organized by date. 7 years of clean, continuous, properly executed documentation. A court finalization. No legal challenges in the record. This is good, she said, which he already knew. But money and good lawyers can slow down good paperwork considerably, and it would be irresponsible of me not to say that clearly. He told her he understood. He asked what he needed to do. She told him to keep doing exactly what he'd been doing for 7 years, to document everything going forward and to call her immediately if anything changed. He did not tell Claire any of this yet. He watched her in the evenings, doing homework at the kitchen table, drawing in her sketchbook, watching 30 minutes of television before bed, with the selective attention she brought to all screens, extracting what interested her and dismissing the rest. She had not asked about the woman from the competition. Whether this was because she hadn't had noticed more than she let on, or because she was processing it in her usual interior way, he couldn't say. He watched her and measured the distance between what she knew and what she would eventually need to know, and understood that the distance was going to close on its own timetable regardless of his preferences, and that his job was to be present for the closing. Diana's lawyers called Gwen Ferris 3 days after the competition. The request was straightforward, a DNA test voluntarily submitted by both parties, results shared with both parties conducted through a certified laboratory with proper chain of custody. Marcus agreed immediately because the result was not something he feared, and because delay would serve no one, least of all Claire, who existed at the center of this situation without yet knowing that the situation had grown. The test was administered on a Wednesday morning at a lab in the Pearl District, clinical and efficient cotton swabs and paperwork, and a technician who was professionally incurious about the people in front of her. Marcus brought Claire under the pretense of a routine doctor's appointment, and he felt the gap between what he said and what was true, and noted it as a debt to be repaid with honesty when the time was right. Diana arrived separately, left separately. She nodded to him across the waiting room with the nod of two people who have a shared business matter and have agreed without discussing it to conduct themselves professionally until it is resolved. They met twice more during the 3-week window, both times in Gwen Ferris's office, both times with lawyers present, both times in the particular atmosphere of meetings that are entirely about procedure and entirely not. Diana came alone both times, which suggested she had not told anyone in her company about this, which made a certain kind of sense. She was controlled and precise in both meetings, asking clear questions and receiving clear answers, and not providing more information than was directly relevant to the matter at hand. He watched her across the table and saw in the margins of her composure the evidence of what it cost, the slight over-precision of her speech, the way she would occasionally pause a half-second longer than necessary before answering, as though verifying that the answer she was about to give was the one she had decided on. In the second meeting, the lawyers stepped out briefly over a scheduling question, and the room held just the two of them. Diana was looking at a document. Without looking up, she asked, "Does she know she was adopted?" He told her yes, since Claire was 3 in increments appropriate to her age. A pause. How did she handle it? He considered the question and gave it the answer it deserved. She asked if I chose her or if she was assigned to me like a school project. He watched Diana's hands stop moving. I told her I chose her. She seemed satisfied with that. Diana looked up then briefly, and whatever was in her expression lasted only a second before she returned to the document, but he had enough time to see it something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite recognition, but occupied the precise territory between them. He had kept the detail of what happened in the second meeting in his head, turning it over in the evenings after Claire went to sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold. He was not a man who spent much time analyzing other people's interior lives. He tended to take people at the level they presented themselves and trust them to communicate what he needed to know. But something about Diana Ashworth resisted easy categorization, and he found himself returning to her, not the CEO of it, not the controlled professional performance of it, but the thing he'd seen underneath in the moments when the architecture of her composure admitted a draft. He told Claire on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the competition, sitting on the back steps of their building, where the small concrete area that might generously be called a patio caught the last of the afternoon light. She had come home from school and done her homework without being asked, which was her signal that she was in a cooperative mood, and he had made grilled cheese and tomato soup, and they had eaten at the kitchen table, and after the dishes, he asked her to come sit outside with him, which she did, bringing her sketchbook in case the conversation allowed for drawing. He told her in the same way he told her everything important, plainly without drama, with the accurate language of someone who respected her enough not to soften facts into unrecognizability. He told her that the woman from the competition appeared to be related to her by birth. He told her that a test had been done to find out for certain. He told her that until the results came back, nothing was decided or determined. He told her that she had a father who had chosen her 7 years ago and had not stopped choosing her since and was not going to stop choosing her now. She listened to all of it with her sketchbook closed on her lap. The afternoon light was doing its October thing, going gold at the edges, making the concrete look warmer than it was. When he finished, she was quiet for a while, looking at the fence at the back of the yard, and he waited because that was what you did. So she's my real mom. She gave birth to you. But you're my real dad, dead, not a question. Yes. She was quiet again. He watched her profile, the serious set of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows that appeared when she was doing interior work. Then, without inflection, delivered the way children deliver the questions that cost the most, the ones they've been carrying quietly until they find the right moment to put down. Did she leave me because I cried too much? The quality of the silence that followed was different from the previous silences. He felt the weight of the question in his chest, the specific gravity of a 7-year-old's attempts to assign cause to abandonment. The desperate logic of it, the way children will locate the fault in themselves before they will locate it anywhere else. Because the alternative that something vast and incomprehensible had happened beyond anyone's control is a harder thing to hold. He took a breath. No. He kept his voice level because level was what she needed, not soft, not urgent level. She was scared. Scared people make wrong decisions. That was not your fault. It was never your fault. Claire looked at the fence for another moment. Then she opened her sketchbook and picked up a pencil, which he recognized as her way of saying she had received what she needed and was now going to process it through the only language that fully satisfied her. He stayed on the steps while she drew. He did not look at what she was drawing. After about 20 minutes, she went inside and he stayed outside in the cooling air and felt the particular exhaustion of conversations that matter, the kind that spend you in ways that are worth being spent. She brought the drawing to him before bed. The third figure in the corner, the one she had rendered in lighter strokes, always slightly apart, always oriented toward the others, had moved. Not arrived, just moved, closer than before. 14 days after the test, Diana Ashworth sat alone in her office at 6:50 in the morning. The floor was empty at that hour. The cleaning crew had finished an hour before and the first early arriving staff wouldn't be in until 7:30, and she had the particular solitude of a large building that is between its human uses, all the ambient energy of the workday, not yet activated, everything in readiness. The envelope from the laboratory had been on her desk when she came in, delivered overnight, sitting in the center of her blotter, with the impassivity of objects that do not know what they contain. She had made herself coffee first. She had looked at her email, answered two that needed immediate response, and set down her cup. Then she picked up the envelope. The result was 2 pages. The relevant line was on the first page, third paragraph, 99.97%, probability of biological mother-child relationship. She read it 3 times, not because the words were ambiguous, but because she was doing what she always did with information that exceeded her immediate capacity to integrate. She was reading it again and again until it became part of her operating reality rather than something arriving from outside it. She put the pages down. She unlocked the bottom left drawer of her desk, the one with the key she kept on a ring separate from her others, the one that contained documents she had never shared with legal or HR or anyone employed by the company. She took out a folded piece of paper. It was a piece of standard notebook paper folded in thirds, the crease lines softened by years of handling. She opened it. It was a list written in her own handwriting from 7 years ago, ink slightly faded, the paper bearing the faint watermark of tears that had dried and left no other evidence. At the top, she had written in larger letters than the rest the word names. Below it, Charlotte, Caroline, Claire. She placed the laboratory report beside the list. She sat with both of them in front of her and did not cry and did not cry and was simply present in the way that is available to people who have already paid for their grief in advance, who have already made all the deposits and are now simply watching the account balance update. She called her private investigator, the one she had found herself without Victor's involvement. 18 months after the previous investigator had returned, nothing, a man named Dale Hurst who worked out of a building in Beaverton and charged reasonable rates and never overpromised. She gave him a name, Marcus Webb, Southeast Portland. She asked him to pull everything that was publicly available. And then she called a family law attorney she had researched the previous week without telling anyone, and she asked for an emergency consultation that afternoon. What she learned in Dale Hurst's report, delivered to her secure email 4 hours later, confirmed what the silver bracelet had already suggested. Marcus Webb had adopted a female infant through the Multnomah County system in the summer of 2018 following her discovery in his cab in November 2017. The record was clean, the process properly executed, the documentation unimpeachable. He had worked for the same company for 9 years. He had no criminal record, no civil judgments, no record of debt collection beyond ordinary credit activity. He lived in the same apartment he had lived in for 11 years. He attended Claire's school events consistently. His neighbor, a retired teacher named Vera Potts, had served as informal childcare support for years, and described him in the one interview Hearst had conducted as the kind of man who fixes things before you know they're broken. She read that last detail twice, then set the report down. Victor Ashworth knocked on her office door at 2 in the afternoon. She had been expecting him since the morning, had been watching the clock with the awareness of someone who knows what's coming and is determining the best position in which to receive it. He entered with his usual ease, the ease of a man accustomed to entering rooms as though he belonged there more than anyone else, and closed the door behind him, and she noted that he did not ask permission to sit, simply did it, which she had watched him do her entire life, and was only now assembling into its correct meaning. He did not pretend not to know. That had never been Victor's style. His style was to engage directly with the facts as a way of controlling the narrative before anyone else could. "I've heard about what happened at the exhibition," he said, settling in the chair across from her desk. "It must have been a shock." She looked at him steadily. She had been looking at Victor her entire adult life, watching him manage her first as her father's trusted CFO, and then as the person who had stepped into the governance gap after her parents died, the person who had guided her through the worst period of her life with such patient care that she had not noticed the guidance was directional, had not noticed that each act of support had a destination. "It was surprising," she said, keeping her voice neutral, giving him nothing. He nodded with the nodding of a man performing thoughtfulness. Then he said the child was biologically an Ashworth, which meant she had a claim under the family trust to 15% of company shares. And as the closest available blood relative who understood the company's interests, he was in the best position to file for guardianship and ensure those interests were properly managed. She looked at him across the desk. She had built this company. Around this company that had been failing when she took it over, that had recovered because she had worked 14-hour days for 3 years and made decisions that kept her awake at night and demanded things from herself that she was not always sure she had to give. She looked at the man who had been present for all of that and said, "Get out of my office." He offered, standing, smoothing his jacket. "I'm only trying to protect the family, same as always." The door closed behind him. She sat with those words, "same as always," in the way you sit with a phrase that has suddenly revealed a dimension you missed in all its previous appearances. She thought about the investigator Victor had recommended in 2019. She thought about the report that had found nothing. She thought about the fact that Victor had been the one to arrange the transfer of the baby in 2017, that he had handled all of it while she recovered, that she had given him the authority because she was 28 and exhausted, and believed the thing he kept saying, which was that it was temporary, it was only temporary. She would get the baby back when things were stable. She thought about the specific firmness with which he had told her in 2019 that the family had simply moved on, that the foster system sometimes lost track of placements, that she needed to accept this and focus on the company, that the investigation was a distraction she couldn't afford. She thought about how she had accepted this. She thought about how the accepting of it had been the thing that had required the most of her, more than rebuilding the company, more than the 14-hour days, more than any professional demand she had ever faced. This one act of forced acceptance that she had accomplished by building a wall, she was only now in this office, at this desk, beginning to understand was a wall and not a foundation. She called her private investigator again. She gave him Victor's name. She called Marcus Webb that evening from her cell phone, not through the lawyers. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the slight roughness of a man who had been working physical hours, the quality of genuine tiredness, rather than the performed exhaustion of people who manage other people. She told him she had received the results. She told him she had reason to believe Victor Ashworth had interfered with the original placement in 2017 and that she had initiated a private investigation to determine the extent of that interference. She told him she was not certain of the results yet, but that she was telling him now because he had a right to know, for it became a legal matter, because she had determined over the past 3 weeks that he was the kind of person who handled information responsibly. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. She waited. "Why are you telling me this directly?" It was the question she'd expected and also the one she hadn't fully prepared for, and she was tired enough at the end of this particular day that the honest answer came before the strategic one could intercept it. "Because I've been looking for her for 5 years, and I think Victor is the reason I couldn't find her. And I think we're on the same side now, whether we like it or not." Another pause longer. She could hear something in the background, faint, that might have been a television, or might have been rain against a window. I'll listen to what you have, he said finally. That's all I can promise right now. It was she understood exactly the right amount to promise, and the fact that he knew that told her something she hadn't known 3 weeks ago. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Gwen Ferris's office to find a legal notification waiting. Victor Ashworth had filed a petition with the Multnomah County Family Court requesting a review of Claire Webb's guardianship arrangements on the grounds that the child was a biological Ashworth and that the current guardian lacked qualifying familial connection. The petition had been filed the previous afternoon within hours of Victor's conversation with Diana, timed with the precision of a man who had been watching the situation develop and had chosen his moment. Marcus sat in the chair across from Gwen Ferris and read the document twice. The language was careful and lawyered and contained within its careful structure the mechanism by which a stranger with resources could slow down 7 years of unimpeachable love. Gwen Ferris watched him read. When he finished, she said, "Your paperwork is solid, but I want you to understand clearly what we're dealing with." He folded the document and placed it on the desk. He thought about Claire at the kitchen table that morning, eating cereal, reading the back of the box with the focused attention she brought to all text her hair in the braid he had finished in 4 minutes, because 7 years of practice had made the difficulty invisible. He thought about all the things that had been true in the world for 7 years, without requiring legal defense and the cost of the translation from lived truth to documented argument. Ray was in the break room when Marcus arrived at his shift. Marcus poured coffee and leaned against the counter and told him the compressed version of what had happened. Ray listened with his arms folded, his expression working through the information in real time. "So, some rich guy is trying to take your kid because she's related to money." Marcus drank his coffee. "Looks like it." Ray looked at him for a moment and then said what he said, not because it was clever, but because it was the truest thing available. "You've been showing up for that kid every single day for 7 years without anyone asking you to. A piece of paper filed yesterday doesn't change what those 7 years built." Marcus held his coffee cup and understood with the specific clarity that comes from hearing something you already know said aloud by someone who has earned the right to say it, that Ray was correct and that being correct was all either of them needed from this conversation. He worked his full shift. He picked up Claire from after-school care. He made dinner. He helped her with her reading homework and watched her draw for 20 minutes before bed and tucked her in and kissed her on the forehead and turned off the light and stood in the hallway outside her room for a moment, listening to the settling sounds of the apartment, the refrigerator cycling the traffic outside, the ordinary music of a life in progress. Then he went to the kitchen and opened the binder he had started assembling that afternoon and continued building the case that was not a case that was simply a life documented. They met on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop on Southeast Division, the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. Wooden tables worn smooth by years of elbows and coffee rings, windows that let in the gray November light without filtering it. Marcus arrived 10 minutes early and ordered black coffee and sat with his back to the wall. Diana arrived exactly on time, and she was not wearing a suit, which told him something. Gray sweater, dark jeans, her hair down rather than up. And she looked like a different person and also exactly the same person, which was the specific quality of seeing someone outside the context in which you had cataloged them. She ordered without looking at the menu and sat across from him and placed a manila folder on the table between them. Not the aggressive placement of someone making a declaration, but the careful placement of someone offering something they are not sure will be accepted. He looked at the folder without opening it. Outside Division Street was doing its Saturday morning thing, foot traffic and passing cars, and a man walking a large brown dog that was investigating every inch of the sidewalk with professional thoroughness. The folder contained 41 pages. Dale Hurst's report was organized chronologically and sourced specifically and contained no conclusions that weren't supported by the preceding material. Marcus read through it at the table while Diana drank her coffee and looked out the window, giving him the reading time without comment. What the report described was a sequence of events that had the particular logic of things done by someone who understood systems well enough to use them against themselves. Victor Ashworth had not placed Diana's newborn daughter with a foster family. He had transported the infant from Providence Hospital in a private vehicle and had placed her in the back seat of a cab parked in a commercial lot 4 blocks from the hospital. The cab company's manifest from that night showed the vehicle had been left unlocked in an unmonitored section of the lot during a shift change. The infant had been placed there at approximately 11:15 in the evening. Marcus had found her 45 minutes later and called 911, which Victor had apparently calculated as the likely outcome. What Victor had not calculated or had calculated and considered acceptable was that the man who found her would subsequently adopt her and remain in Portland for the next 7 years. The report documented a second element that was considerably more serious. Between January 2018 and March 2020, Victor Ashworth had authorized a series of payments from an Ashworth Logistics operational account to three consulting entities that the investigator had been unable to identify as legitimate businesses. Total disbursements, $342,000. The authorization signatures on 18 of those transactions appeared inconsistent with Diana's known signature on other documents from the same period, a discrepancy the investigator attributed to possible forgery pending expert analysis. Marcus closed the folder. He looked across the table at the woman who had sat in this chair knowing what it contained, and he felt the compound weight of what she had done in bringing it here rather than using it in some other way, and he said, "You could have used this to fight me for her." Diana looked at him with the steady attention of someone who has anticipated this point of the conversation and worked out exactly where they stand on it. "I know." A pause, the length of something being decided and then accepted. "Why didn't you?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, a small gesture, something that was not executive composure, but something more ordinary and more honest. "Because I watched you with her for 30 seconds in that lobby, and I knew what I was looking at." He waited. "What were you looking at?" She looked at him with something that had taken 7 years in a 41-page report in this particular November morning to become fully available, the father she deserved. He did not look away, and she did not look away. And the coffee shop continued its morning around them, indifferent and warm, and he thought about what it cost a person to say a thing like that, to hand it to the person who needed to hear it, without keeping any for yourself. They spent the next hour going through the report together, section by section, Marcus asking specific questions, and Diana answering them as completely as she was able. She had started her own investigation of Victor 6 days earlier. She had also consulted with an employment attorney about the implications of the forged signatures and the fraudulent disbursements. The picture that was emerging was of a man who had used a crisis to create leverage and had then maintained that leverage by ensuring the crisis never fully resolved, because a Diana Ashworth who was still searching for her lost child was a Diana Ashworth who needed him, who was grateful for his support, who would not look too carefully at the numbers she was signing off on because she was carrying something heavier than the numbers. Gwen Ferris received a copy of the report by secure email that afternoon, along with a letter from Diana's family law attorney indicating that Diana Ashworth intended to appear as a cooperating witness in any proceeding related to Claire Webb's guardianship and would be providing evidence material to the court's assessment of Victor Ashworth's petition. Gwen called Marcus that evening. "This changes the picture considerably," she said, which from Gwen Ferris was approximately equivalent to anyone else saying the picture had changed entirely. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in December in the Multnomah County Family Court building on Southwest 4th. Marcus spent the intervening weeks doing what he always did when something important was coming. He prepared. He pulled together every document he owned related to Claire, organized them chronologically in a binder with labeled dividers. 7 years of pediatric records, 7 years of school enrollment records, teacher communications, the original police report from November 2017, the court's adoption finalization documents, the signed letters from Mrs. Potts, from Claire's current teacher, from the school counselor who had assessed Claire twice, and both times described her as emotionally secure and well attached to her primary caregiver. He delivered the completed binder to Gwen Ferris 2 weeks before the hearing, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression that combined professional approval with something that was almost personal. "You've been building this case for 7 years." He told her he hadn't been building a case. He'd been raising a child. She said those were sometimes the same thing. Diana came to the apartment on a Sunday afternoon 12 days before the hearing. She stood in the doorway when he opened it, and he saw her register the space in the way that people do when a room tells them something about a life. The drawings covering the refrigerator door entirely, The second-hand bookshelf organized by size in the way of a child who had imposed her own logic on the system, the kitchen table with its jar of colored pencils in the center, that served as both decoration and tool. She was not performing anything in this moment. She was simply present in a way that none of their previous meetings had quite allowed. Claire was at the kitchen table working on something. She looked up when Diana came in, a direct look without self-consciousness. Diana stopped inside the door, and her hands had no purpose in this context, nothing to carry or anchor them, and she held them at her sides with the slight uncertainty of someone operating without their usual tools. "You can sit down," Claire said, returning to her drawing. Not a warm invitation and not an unwelcoming one. Simply a practical statement about available options. Diana sat. She looked at the labeled stickers on the side of the pencil jar, each one bearing the name of a color in the neat, careful print of a man who had decided that knowing the name of a thing was a form of ownership over it. "You label all your pencils." Claire did not look up. Dad did. He said if you know the name of something, you're less afraid of it. Diana looked at Marcus, who was at the counter with his back partially turned, and something in the angle of her looking told him she understood he was listening and had chosen this position deliberately. Claire worked in silence for a few minutes. Then, without lifting her pencil from the page, without any shift in tone, "Are you ashamed of me?" The question arrived with the clean precision of something that had been waiting for the right moment. Diana went still in the involuntary way of someone struck in an unguarded place. "What?" Claire looked up, her face serious and direct. "My friend Jalen said his birth mom gave him up because she was ashamed of him. Are you ashamed of me?" Diana got up from the chair and came around the table and knelt on the kitchen floor next to Claire's chair, which put her at ear level, and the composure she had built and maintained and defended across 7 years of loss, in work, in grief, was not present in her face at this proximity in this kitchen with this child. "No, I was scared of losing everything at once, and I made the worst decision of my life, but not because of you, never because of you." Claire looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating attention she gave things she was deciding about. Then she looked back at her drawing. Then, as though selecting the right tool, "What should I call you?" Diana sat back slightly. "Whatever feels right. There's no rush." Claire considered this, the pencil turning slowly in her fingers. "I'll let you know when I figure it out." Diana nodded once. "That's fair." Marcus did not turn around from the counter for another full minute. When he did, Claire was drawing again, and Diana had returned to her chair and was watching Claire work with an expression he had no word for and did not try to find one. He put 2 mugs of coffee on the table without being asked, and Diana wrapped her hands around hers, and the afternoon continued. The courtroom was on the 4th floor and smelled the way public buildings smell of managed air and years of other people's difficult days. Marcus arrived with Gwen Ferris at 8:50. Victor arrived at 9 with 2 attorneys and took his place at the petitioner's table with the settled confidence of a man who had done his calculations and arrived at a favorable result. Diana arrived alone at 9:02 and sat in the gallery, which made Victor's left shoulder tighten in a way he tried to conceal. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Harriet Bowman, who had the manner of someone who had heard every variation of every family court argument and retained the capacity to find them individually interesting. Victor's petition rested on 3 pillars. Marcus Webb had no biological relationship to the child. Victor Ashworth was the closest available extended family member of the biological mother, and the child's long-term interests would be better served under the guardianship of someone with greater resources. The argument was constructed with care and delivered with the confidence of people who believe that money and logic properly combined constitute an unanswerable case. Gwen Ferris presented Marcus's documentation with organized efficiency, the adoption finalization, the 7 years of continuous custodial record, the medical history, the school records, the teacher attestations, the original police report establishing Marcus as the person who had reported the child's discovery rather than benefited from her concealment. She pointed out that the Ashworth petition had been filed within 24 hours of Victor learning about the DNA results and noted that the timing had a quality the court might find worth considering. Then she called Diana to testify. Diana walked from the gallery to the witness stand with the walk of someone who has decided something and is executing the decision. Victor's attorney began immediately. Ms. Ashworth, you signed documents in 2017 relinquishing your parental rights. On what basis should this court give weight to your current testimony? Diana looked at the attorney without the social discomfort the question was designed to produce. In 2017, I was 28 years old. I had lost both my parents within the previous month. I was facing the potential bankruptcy of the company my family had built. I had been systematically advised by the man at that table that disclosing my pregnancy would cost me the company and everything my parents had worked for. I signed those documents in the context of acute grief, professional pressure, and the explicit promise that the arrangement was temporary. She kept her voice even, the voice of someone delivering a record rather than making an argument. I was wrong to sign them. I will carry that for the rest of my life. But the arrangement Victor Ashworth described to me and the arrangement he actually executed were not the same arrangement. He told me my daughter would be placed with a vetted family. He placed her in an unoccupied vehicle in a commercial parking lot. I did not authorize that. I did not know that until 11 days ago. And this court has the documentation to verify everything I've just said. The room held a particular quality of attention after she finished. Victor's attorneys conferred in the tight-shouldered way of people absorbing unwelcome information. Judge Bowman examined the documentation Gwen Ferris had submitted and asked two specific questions about chain of custody. Then she looked at Victor Ashworth directly and called a recess to review the submitted materials. During the recess, Marcus stood in the corridor and drank water from a paper cup. Diana came out and stood a few feet away, not intruding, and after a moment, that took guts. Coming in here with your binder and your 7 years and no money behind it. He crushed the paper cup, found a trash can. What you did in there? She looked at the light on the corridor floor. It took 7 years. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. When court reconvened, Judge Bowman noted that the documentation raised significant concerns about the circumstances of the original placement that fell outside the scope of the current custody petition and would require referral to additional authorities. She further noted that the petitioner's standing as a blood relative did not in itself constitute grounds for overriding a valid adoption finalization in the absence of evidence that the current arrangement was detrimental to the child's welfare, of which she found none. She dismissed Victor Ashworth's petition. She also noted that the materials related to the fraudulent disbursements in the potentially forged signatures were being referred to the appropriate investigative bodies. Victor left the courtroom without looking at Diana. She watched him go with the expression of someone closing an account they had kept open too long. The fraud investigation moved on a federal timeline. Victor Ashworth resigned from Ashworth Logistics in January, which Diana accepted in writing without comment. Marcus enrolled in the business operations program at Portland Community College that same month evening, classes twice a week, the classroom full of people in their 30s and 40s who were adding to something rather than beginning it. He paid the first semester himself with a study grant for working adults that he had found and applied for without telling anyone. Diana learned about the enrollment from Claire, who mentioned it with the casual ease of someone reporting ordinary household information. She did not offer to pay for it. She understood by now the specific shape of Marcus Webb's independence, the way it was not pride exactly, but something more structural, more load-bearing, the thing the whole edifice stood on. What she did 2 weeks after the spring semester began was called the Director of Operations at Ashworth Logistics and described without preamble and without naming the person she was describing, a warehouse professional with 12 years of experience in logistics optimization who had reduced pallet error rates by 30% in his current role over 4 years, who had trained 11 new hires in the past 2 years, and who understood the relationship between floor-level operations and systems-level efficiency in a way that was not teachable in a classroom. She asked if the director had any open positions. He said he had one. She said good and hung up. Marcus received the recruitment call 3 days later from the director himself. He went to the interview because the position was real and his qualifications were real, and there was nothing in either of those facts that required him to investigate the circumstances further. He answered questions from 2 people across a conference table with the plain confidence of someone who knows exactly what they know. He was offered the position at the end of the meeting, operations coordinator, the job he had been doing informally for 4 years, made official and made useful at a different scale. He told Claire over dinner. She looked up from her plate. "Will you still be home for dinner?" He told her yes. She nodded and returned to her food satisfied, which was the complete extent of the ceremony she felt the occasion required, and he found this clarifying in the way he always found Claire clarifying her instinct for the essential, making everything else easier to see. Diana began coming to the apartment on Sundays. Not every Sunday and not with the regularity of a scheduled event, but with the naturalness of something that had found its own frequency. She and Claire developed their particular language incrementally built from small exchanges and shared attention because Claire approached all relationships the way she approached drawings, starting with the structure before adding the color, making sure the underlying lines were right before committing to the surface. Diana brought a set of fine-tipped markers one Sunday because Claire had mentioned that her current set bled through the paper, and they spent an hour drawing side by side in the particular companionship of two people working on separate things in the same space. And Marcus sat in the living room with his textbook and thought about the architecture of trust, how it was built from the accumulation of small moments rather than the declaration of large ones. The Sunday that changed things was in March, 5 months after the courtroom, a morning with the tentative quality of early Oregon spring. Diana had arrived and Claire had immediately pulled her toward the kitchen table where an ambitious project was in progress, a drawing that covered 3 sheets of paper taped together. Marcus made coffee and left them to it. He was in the living room when he heard Claire very clearly use a word she had not used before, not loudly, not with announcement, just in the middle of a sentence about a color she was reaching for. "Mom, can you hand me the blue?" A brief, unremarkable silence. Then Diana, her voice carrying the quality of something held very carefully, "Which blue?" And Claire not looking up, completely absorbed in the work, "The dark one, the one that looks like before it rains." Marcus kept his eyes on the page in front of him. He sat with the sound of it in the room in the apartment, in the ordinary March morning, and felt something shift that had been waiting to shift, something in the structure of things that had been holding its breath and had now quietly let it out. The foundation announcement came in April at a press event Diana had organized to be neither large nor managed feeling. 12 journalists, a small room, no podium. She called it the Claire Webb Scholarship Fund, a scholarship for children in the foster system in single-parent households across Oregon. A reporter asked why this cause specifically. Diana had prepared an answer. What she said instead was something that came from the place where things live before you know you're going to say them. "Someone once asked me if I was ashamed of her. I want to make sure she knows the answer, not just in private, but in every available way." Marcus watched the live stream on his phone in the parking lot of Portland Community College, between classes, and looked at the small screen for a long time after Diana stopped speaking. 3 years moved through the way time moves when the people inside it are paying attention. Claire turned 8, and then 9, and then 10 each year, adding new layers to her work, her eye developing the discipline to match her instinct. Marcus finished his PCC program and found that the operations coordinator role had begun to feel like something he was inside rather than something he was new to. Diana and Marcus talked more across the months and then the years, with the increasing ease of people who have been tested by the same difficult things and have come out standing. The competition was held at the Portland Art Museum on a Saturday in November, 10 years to the month after a rainy night on Burnside, and the room was full and warm, and the work on the walls was remarkable, in the way that children's remarkable work always is, all instinct and no artifice. Claire's piece was large 3 sheets of paper taped together in the format she had been developing for 2 years, and it hung on the main wall. It showed 2 hands, adult hands different in their particulars, reaching from opposite edges of the frame toward the center, where a smaller hand was held by both of them. The smaller hand held a paintbrush. The title written in Claire's practiced lettering at the bottom, "Home." When Claire walked to the microphone to receive the award, Marcus was in the 3rd row with Ray beside him, Ray doing the thing he always did at these events, which was stop pretending and simply let his face do what it was doing unguarded, which was the truest thing about Ray Kowalski and always had been. Diana was 3 seats down, separated from Marcus by 2 empty chairs, and the chair where Claire had been sitting, which still held Claire's jacket and her drawing bag, in the small labeled pencil case she carried everywhere. Claire stood at the microphone with the composure of someone who had been practicing composure by watching the people who raised her, and she looked out at the room and said what she had decided to say. "I used to think family was one person showing up for you. Now I think it's about everyone deciding every single day to keep showing up. My dad taught me that being strong doesn't mean not being scared. My mom taught me that it's never too late to be brave. I painted this for both of them. Marcus looked at his daughter on the stage holding her award. He looked at her jacket on the chair between him and Diana at the pencil case with its small, labeled stickers naming each color so precisely. He looked at Diana. She was looking at the stage, her jaw set against what her eyes were doing anyway, holding herself the way people hold themselves when they have survived something that should have broken them and are only now in a room full of light, allowing themselves to understand that they have survived it. He reached across to the armrest of Claire's empty chair, not toward Diana, just toward the chair, the space their daughter had left. And Diana, without looking away from the stage, reached from her side and placed her hand on the armrest too, and their hands did not touch, just rested close on either side of something that belonged to both of them. The ceremony ended. Claire came down from the stage and navigated through the crowd and arrived at the row and picked up her jacket in one motion. "Can we get pizza, both of you, together?" She said it the way she said most things she had already decided, as a question that was also a statement, leaving just enough room for the form of agreement without requiring the substance of negotiation. Marcus looked at Diana. She looked at him, and in her face was something that had been building since a conference room 7 years ago, or since a parking lot in November 2017, or since a list of names written by a woman alone in an apartment who had not yet understood what kind of story she was in. She was not performing anything, and there was nothing here that required a performance. She was just a woman in a museum on a November evening being asked to get pizza, and her face opened the way a room opens when it has been given light after a long time of being closed. "I know a place," she said. Outside, Portland was doing what Portland does in November. The rain holding off for once, the air cold and clean. The streetlights were coming on in the early dark. Claire walked ahead of them on the sidewalk with the proprietary confidence of someone leading a group through familiar territory, her award under one arm, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Marcus walked beside Diana, not close enough to touch, close enough to feel the warmth of another person in the cold, which is its own kind of language, available to people who have learned to pay attention to it. Claire turned back to check they were still following the way she had been checking since she was 2 years old, launching herself off furniture, and then looking back to confirm the net was still there. He raised a hand. She turned back around and led them forward into the lit and ordinary evening.